Okay, so hello, we are live. So this is Brian Cutter. He's a philosopher responsible for maybe the best argument for theism, or partially responsible, the argument from psychophysical harmony, and also another argument that's also pretty good, but uh, maybe like top five. But uh, of course, top one is of course the anthropic argument that Amos and I are working on a paper on. So yeah. So we're gonna be talking about the argument from nomological harmony. So do you want to just kind of like lay out what the argument is?
Yeah, sure. So this is well, it's sort of an argument that's in a paper that I recently wrote with Brad Sod. In the paper, we don't exactly cast it as an argument for theism, though I'm friendly to that interpretation of it. Maybe more than my co-author was. So maybe I'll give it that spin here. So let's start with the fact, or the puzzle of nomological harmony, which is the name we give it in the paper. So the basic thought to begin with is that our universe is governed by laws that match its contents or its states. So, there are laws saying how massive bodies are supposed to behave. And sure enough, there exist massive bodies for those laws to govern. There exist charged particles. And sure enough, there are laws specifying how charged particles are to behave. Now, like it didn't obviously have to be this way. Like conceivably, there could have been like mismatches between the laws and the contents of the universe. So it could have been that there are laws saying how massive things are to behave, but there are no massive things in existence, only schmassive things. Or there could have been charged particles, but no laws saying how charged particles are to behave, only laws governing schmarged particles. Or it could have been that our universe had Newtonian initial conditions paired with relativistic laws that don't apply to them, or relativistic initial conditions together with Newtonian laws that don't apply to them. In which case, it looks like the initial conditions of the universe would have been unengaged by the laws. The universe would have been stillborn. There would have been like no interesting kind of temporal evolution induced by the laws. So the question, or the initial puzzle, is just like, why is there this nice match between the laws of our universe and the contents or states of our universe? I don't think that this should be taken just as a brute, unexplained fact. Like we ordinarily think that the basic dynamical laws just involve a small number of fundamental properties and relations, and that the initial conditions of our universe just involve a small number of basic properties and relations. And presumably there's like countlessly many possible fundamental properties and relations. So without some kind of further story, we wouldn't expect a match. And so the question is just like, assuming this is not a brute fact, and we shouldn't take it to be a brute fact, what explains it? Now, I think that the best explanations for nomological harmony are ultimately going to posit a kind of what we call a third factor. So something that's kind of explanatorily prior to the basic laws and initial conditions of the universe that explains their harmonious correspondence. So maybe, this God would be a natural candidate for such a third factor. Though, I mean, it could be that there are other non-theistic third factor explanations. So maybe to get a flavor for what would motivate a third factor explanation, it helps to look at some alternative explanations. So maybe let's look at three. There's what we call ensemble explanations, Humean explanations, and powers-based explanations. So the ensemble explanations, these are kind of inspired by multiverse explanations of cosmological fine-tuning, which I'll just assume that your listeners are familiar with. So the basic idea is we posit some vast collection of either laws or universes, or maybe both. And then we argue that given the postulated ensemble, a match between some laws and some initial conditions is to be expected. So one version of this would say, maybe there's just like a huge number of basic laws. So there's laws saying what massive things do and what charged things do. But there's also laws governing like schmarged objects and schmassive objects and so on. And most of these laws like don't have anything to operate on, just like like a rule book for a game where there's no corresponding pieces, like a rule book for checkers when there's no checkers pieces around. But if there are enough laws, then maybe it would be unsurprising that at least some of them actually engage the actual contents of reality, so as to induce some temporal evolution. That would be one version. Another version says, well, maybe there's a single relatively small set of laws as we ordinarily think, but maybe there's a huge number of different universes, all of which have like different kinds of initial conditions involving different properties at the initial conditions. So there are some universes with like mass and charge at the initial conditions, some universes with schmass and schmarge at the initial conditions. And most of these universes in the multiverse are stillborn because the laws don't apply to them, so as to induce temporal evolution. But given a large enough and a sufficiently varied set of universes, maybe it would be unsurprising for the laws to apply to at least some initial conditions, and off we go. And then maybe we invoke an observation selection effect to explain like why we find ourselves in one of the fortunate universes where the laws apply, because there aren't any observers around in the other universes. I think we should reject ensemble explanations. I mean, I think their biggest problems just have to do with theoretical parsimony. So think about the first version that posits this huge number of fundamental laws governing all manner of possible fundamental properties. This is going to commit serious violations against what you call like nomological parsimony, which is the dimension of theoretical parsimony, which has to do with keeping the fundamental laws as simple as possible. So we ordinarily think that in theory choice, like we prefer theories that are simpler in certain respects. And one important respect for theory choice is like, how simple are the fundamental laws? Do we have a small number of relatively tidy fundamental laws? Do we have a huge number? Generally, like we try to keep things simpler nomologically. These views are not going to score particularly well with respect to those dimensions of parsimony. Other versions of the ensemble account are going to score poorly with respect to like qualitative parsimony, which has to do with like the number of fundamental kinds of things, or the number of fundamental instantiated properties that your theory postulates. These theories do about as badly as you could possibly do with respect to these dimensions of parsimony. Okay, so that's kind of like the initial reason to reject ensemble accounts. Yeah, I mean, I'll go on to talk about like the Humean and the powers-based accounts. But do you have any? Do you want to jump in at?
No, yeah. I mean, I think that was good. Yeah. So I mean, when I first heard of the argument, it seemed like the obvious response is like, okay, well, but if there's a powers-based view, then the argument doesn't apply. But I think you in the paper explain well why it actually the same puzzle, or at least a very structurally similar puzzle, applies to the powers-based view. So do you want to?
Yeah, good. So maybe I'll just jump to that and skip over the Humean stuff. So yeah, the thought is, suppose we've got a powers-based, or what's sometimes called like a causal essentialist view of laws of nature. So the basic thought here is that laws derive from the essences of natural properties. There's something like descriptions of the causal powers that are essentially conferred on their bearers by actually instantiated properties. So like if it's a law that massive things resist acceleration, then this reflects something about the essence or nature of mass, namely that whatever has it thereby has the power to resist acceleration, and so on. Okay, so laws are kind of descriptions of these causal powers that natural properties essentially, in virtue of their very natures, confer on their bearers. So if we count a generalization as a law, if it kind of describes the causal powers of some actually instantiated natural property, then there's guaranteed to be a kind of match between the laws and the contents of the universe, so that nomological harmony looks not very puzzling. It looks completely unsurprising. So anyway, I think that point is correct as far as it goes. But I think the powers view does give rise to a pretty similar puzzle that we call the puzzle of powers harmony. So the thought is, why is it that the powerful properties present at the initial conditions are harmoniously coordinated in such a way as to induce temporal evolution? So this absolutely does not come for free from the view that properties essentially confer certain causal powers. So just to give some examples, suppose you've just got X's at the initial conditions, and X's essentially have the power to to like move nearby Ys. Well, if there are no Ys around at the initial conditions, then the universe is going to be stillborn. You're not going to get any interesting temporal evolution. Or maybe there are X's and Y's around at the initial condition, and X's essentially have the power to move Y's when they stand in some like relativistic spatial relation. Well, if the X's and Y's find themselves like in a Newtonian spatial arena, then again, the universe is going to be stillborn. And in general, the point is like merely having powerful properties present at the initial conditions is not going to generate temporal evolution unless the stimulus conditions of those properties are met. And that requires at least a fair degree of fine-tuned coordination among the various powerful properties. So just in terms of the game analogy. So we start the paper with this game analogy of like you can think of the universe as kind of akin to a game where the laws are like the rules, the rule book for the game, and the contents of the universe are like the game pieces. And just like you can have mismatched rule books and game pieces, like a rule book for chess doesn't provide any guidance for how checkers pieces can move around the board. So too, like it seems possible in principle to have a mismatched universe. If you want to think about the game analogy in light of the causal essentialist theory, you might imagine like, oh, let's pretend that like checkers pieces essentially have certain powers, like to capture nearby black pieces and hop over things and turn into kings when they reach the end of the board and so on. Well, in order for the stimulus conditions for those powers to be met, you need things kind of set up in the right way. So like if the checkers piece finds itself on a Monopoly board surrounded by Monopoly pieces, like it's just not going to be able to like exercise any of its powers because the stimulus conditions aren't going to be met. So the point is you need a degree of kind of fine-tuned coordination among the powerful properties in order to get temporal evolution on the causal essentialist view. Now, my thought here is like, this is not a reason to reject the causal essentialist view. We can retain the causal essentialist view of natural laws, and I kind of like that view. But we shouldn't just take it as a brute, unexplained fact that the natural properties of the universe are harmoniously coordinated in the way that they are. Rather, we should explain that. How can we explain that? Well, you can give a kind of ensemble explanation. You could say maybe there's a big multiverse and there's lots of different kinds of things. And most, for most of the universes, they're stillborn because the powerful properties aren't harmoniously coordinated. But for a precious few, the properties are harmoniously coordinated, and so we get temporal evolution and then observation selection effect for why we find ourselves in one of those fortunate universes. Again, I think that's going to have some of the same parsimony problems. I would favor something more like a third factor or non-naturalistic explanation for powers harmony. So maybe there's some being prior to nature, outside of nature, maybe something like a traditional god that created the world and did so for reasons, and had reasons for creating natural properties that could harmoniously interact with one another. Now, what reasons might there be for a being to do that? I mean, it's not really hard to think of reasons, because it seems like just about every valuable state of affairs you can think of involving like consciousness and friendship and virtue and knowledge and so on, like they're not going to be present in a stillborn universe. They're not going to be present in a universe where like nothing happens. So like it's not hard to think of reasons why God might prefer to create powers that are harmoniously coordinated rather than powers that don't coordinate and don't interact with one another. So it looks like this is going to lend itself to a theistic explanation. Alternatively, if we accept more like a governing view, where maybe like laws are somehow entities that dynamically produce later states in conjunction with earlier states, as on a governing account, then you can combine that with theism and then give a kind of theistic reasons-based explanation for why God would create governing laws that match the contents of the universe, rather than governing laws that kind of pointlessly like fail to apply to anything that he's actually going to create. And so, that's the basic story.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a lot to like about the argument. I mean, one thing that's nice about the argument is that it works very well with its twin, the argument from psychophysical harmony.
Yeah.
Because if you're like looking at the naturalist friendly, at the like naturalism plus explanations, like axiarchism or a limited God, basically the naturalism knocks out the ones or sorry, psychophysical harmony knocks out the ones that oppose some being whose psychophysical harmony doesn't derive from anything more fundamental, and then nomological harmony knocks out the ones that will appeal to certain laws like axiarchism or natural teleology. And so, sort of together, it seems like they clear the field for all the. And one of them applies to basically all of the views that add some value selection hypothesis to naturalism.
Yeah, I saw you made that point in your recent blog post on nomological harmony. I think that's going to be true of some of the non-naturalistic alternatives to theism, that they're going to run into problems with nomological harmony. It's not totally clear to me whether that's true for certain forms of like axiarchism, like non-theistic axiarchism. So suppose there's just a basic axiarchic law that says that that the world is to be as good as possible, or that the initial conditions and first order laws are to be such as to promote the good, or something like that. Then that law, so I'm thinking this is a kind of like generative law. It's a law that generates certain things in a way that optimizes for value or something like that. Here I don't see that there's a puzzle as to why that law applies to anything, because it generates the very thing that it applies to.
Yeah, I agree with you that I don't think it applies to strictly all forms of, but I think it's going to be hard to have a view that avoids nomological harmony and psychophysical harmony without thinking that there's something that's like, has some very general property for generating good things. But if it has that general property for generating good things, to the extent that it's not like bizarrely arbitrary, then it's just going to run into the same problem of evil. And so I think I think sort of the entire motivation for positing something like, most kinds of axiarchism is, or like some alternative to theism, is that you want to avoid the problem of evil. And so I think that almost every view, with maybe a few exceptions, will either be vulnerable to psychophysical harmony, nomological harmony, or the problem of evil.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I would have thought axiarchism is, at least most forms of axiarchism will be just as vulnerable to the problem of evil, at least prima facie. I mean, it might take away certain resources for dealing with the problem of evil, so maybe it's even harder. But yeah, I mean, that's a complicated issue. There's at least going to be a prima facie problem of evil for axiarchism.
Yeah. Like the versions of axiarchism that I think are more plausible are the ones that say like there are some fundamental laws, but the laws are biased towards producing things of value, and so then that's
I see
the problem. But yeah, if you have a view that like every good thing happens, or the fundamental laws are set up to be like perfectly optimal, then it's not going to be vulnerable to either of those, but it is going to be vulnerable to the problem of evil.
I see. So maybe we start with certain just like basic laws of physics or whatever, but maybe there's like enough indeterminism, or anyway, they don't constrain things to determine a unique future, and then the axiarchic law can kind of like bias the outcomes towards the better rather than the worse.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of view would run into my problem.
Yeah, and I think like if you have a form of axiarchism that's sufficiently powerful that it just like says the best things are what initially starts out, then it's just hard to see why that wouldn't result in God, where it's like God seems like one of the best things.
Yeah, I mean that's like Leslie's view. Like he starts with this like non-personal axiarchic principle, but then that just generates a God. I think for him it generates infinitely many gods. But yeah.
There was something else I was going to say about some attractive feature of the argument. Oh, I mean, one other thing is that I think the argument, like for some of the arguments for theism, like the argument from psychophysical harmony, it's the revenge problem is, well, it may be surmountable. It's at least something of a problem. But I think that this one has a very, there's no revenge problem here, because you posit that God has certain powers, but it doesn't have the vulnerability of the powers view, because the powers view only requires harmony if you have lots of interacting things. Yeah. And so if you just have God, then yeah. So I think it's invulnerable to that. I mean,
yeah, good. So let's talk about that, because that's an interesting point. I'm actually writing a another thing on nomological harmony right now, where I'm trying to just like more explicitly make the case that it's a challenge for naturalism or evidence for theism, more explicitly than we did in the paper. And I'm trying to address this view as to whether this issue as to whether there is a revenge problem. I mean, I agree on the face. It looks like, well, the powers. So first of all, like God is not subject to like external governing laws the way like electrons are governed by external laws on a governing law account. So that kind of problem is not going to apply to God. The powers problem looks like the powers harmony problem looks like it wouldn't apply either for the reason you said. Like that, it looks like that mainly arises when you've got multiple things that interact and they need harmoniously coordinated powers, whereas God is just one thing. Complication that arises here is, suppose you have a view where intrinsic to God there are like multiple distinct powerful properties. Maybe, powerful properties, like properties that essentially ground certain causal powers. Maybe those properties need to kind of play well together in order for God to like act in coherent ways. I mean, I think that the problem is less pressing if you have views where like all of the divine attributes are derivable from some single simple property like pure perfection or absolute intentional power. And like, Swinburne has proposed views like this, and Joshua Rasmussen. And I mean, I think those are just like independently more attractive on parsimony grounds if you can make them work. But if you do have views that kind of veer pretty far from divine simplicity pictures, where you've got like multiple distinct, irreducible, intrinsic properties of God that kind of like come with certain powers, essentially, then there might be a kind of like internal powers harmony revenge problem.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's it's not that the different parts have to interact in, like, suppose you just posit brutally, God has three properties, being all powerful, all knowing, and all good. Yeah. It's not clear that, well, so, I mean, one point is just, I think that if you're a theist, you should definitely have a view like Swinburne's or Rasmussen, where you think God's properties are derivable.
I agree.
Yeah, and so I don't think it'll hurt theism's intrinsic probability that much, even if we think it just totally knocks out the other ones. But, I mean, I don't, it's not that the properties have to like interact. Like, it's just, there's one substance and then it's going to have different properties. There doesn't have to be any like harmonious interactions between the different types of things, the way that there does for the initial state with lots of different things with powers. And so it is true that you're just going to have to say that there's one thing and it happens to have these three properties. Yeah. But that's just the problem, that it's less parsimonious, which was like, that you posit three random properties at the core of reality. That's less parsimonious. That's old news. I don't think it's like I guess I don't really see what the distinct version of the
maybe that's right. I mean, I guess none of those properties would furnish the stimulus conditions for any of the others, arguably.
Yeah.
So it's a somewhat different issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I agree. I mean, theism is I think pretty clearly at least potentially less vulnerable to any of the revenge problems. So that's
yeah. So okay. So now let's talk about some objections to the argument. So one of them is like, and you were going to talk about this a little bit earlier, but you think if you're a Humean, then the argument. And so just to explain briefly what humanism is, for those who don't know, humanism, it says essentially that the laws are, laws are not what makes it the case that things behave in certain ways. Laws are just like a description that things behave in certain ways. So, just like the laws are not what explains why they behave in particular ways. The laws are just a law. It's just a generalization that they behave in particular ways. And so now you make this objection in the paper to the Humean view, where you say that the Humean view makes it really weird that sort of like the way things behave is according to these predictable and physical laws where they harmoniously interact. And I mean, the worry I have, well, so I guess I have two kind of worries with that response. The first one is like I'm not an expert on the laws of nature, but if I remember correctly from the Phil paper survey, it's like split about 50-50 between Humeanism and the other view. And so if it is like, I assume Humeans will have lots of things to say about why this objection is not decisive, because like this is not a particularly new objection, and so it seems like maybe that this limits its dialectical effectiveness if it requires that you accept a view only adopted by about half of philosophers about laws of nature. I have another thing to say, but yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. So yeah, I mean, the objection, just to make it more explicit, is like, yeah, so humanism says, you know, laws are just kind of informative, succinct descriptions of patterns that contingently hold across space and time, and humans often are naturalists, so they think there's nothing prior to or outside the Humean mosaic, the kind of like way in which qualities are distributed across space and time. There's nothing that explains their regularity that's prior to nature. But then it just looks really puzzling why qualities would be distributed across space and time in such a way that they could be kind of informationally compressed to such an astonishing degree in terms of these simple, tidy, exceptionless generalizations. And, you know, one way to make this vivid is it's just obvious in an intuitive sense that like most ways of distributing qualities across space and time, most ways of kind of painting the tiles in of the Humean mosaic are just going to be a completely chaotic, incompressible mess, just like most ways of like filling in pixels on a screen are going to be informationally incompressible, not something you can summarize with a few tidy generalizations. So it's just like the priors for having a uniform, regular, patterned mosaic, conditional upon there being nothing explanatorily prior to the mosaic, just look like astonishingly low. And so, you know, this is a totally unoriginal point, but I just find it convincing that like the most natural prior probability distribution to put over Humean mosaics conditional on naturalism is the one that assigns, you know, basically all the probability mass to the chaotic mosaics and basically none of it to the nicely patterned ones. And so the fact that we find ourselves in a patterned world is just basically decisive evidence against at least the combination of Humeanism and naturalism. Now, I'm open. I actually somewhat like the Humean best systems account of what it is to be a law, but I think that the regularity of the mosaic just calls for explanation. I mean, if anything calls for explanation, that does. So, I mean, so there's the sociological point that, okay, but you know, some large fraction of philosophers are okay with Humeanism. First point, like, this is philosophy. Everything's controversial. I'm never going to give any valid argument for an interesting conclusion, all of whose premises would be accepted by the majority of philosophers. That's not the game we're playing. But second, I mean, I have a kind of psychoanalytic explanation for why people would be more attracted to Humeanism than the reasons and evidence merit, which is basically just that if you people kind of come into philosophy very wedded to secular naturalistic background view, and they'll often kind of accept views that are otherwise unpalatable in order to like maintain their naturalism. So, I mean, I think that's just like a plausible psychological hypothesis. So spot me that for a moment. Now, now we think about laws of nature and like, what are your options really? I mean, well, there's a lot to say here, but here's the simplified version. Either you have these like really weird, mysterious governing laws, these kind of strange entities that are like not really in nature, but they somehow like structure and shape and generate states within nature. And like they kind of do what like God did on a traditional theistic view, but they're definitely not God. They're like relations between universals, or they're just primitive things, but they're like very weird. That I think that just strikes people as just kind of odd. And so what's the alternative? Well, Humeanism is the most natural alternative. And yes, it seems like it makes the regularity of the universe kind of a cosmic coincidence, but hey, explanation needs to end somewhere, and so maybe it's not so bad. I I think this is a view that many people feel just like naturally very uncomfortable with, but they just don't see a way out consistent with their naturalist commitments. Those of us who aren't like wedded dogmatically to naturalism, I think can see like, well, if there is a way out that goes by abandoning naturalism and doesn't accept these like weird governing laws, then let's look at it. Let's see how plausible it is. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, so maybe one more thing to say here is I kind of think of my argument coming in and applying to the person who's already like convinced that humanism is a non-starter for these sorts of familiar reasons, and maybe they're comfortable with just positing these kind of primitive governing laws that just like dynamically generate new states in conjunction with old states, or an Armstrong style view or whatever. And my claim is like, okay, that's that view, because I do think that the problem of nomological harmony, as we initially stated, is primarily a problem for that governing account. And the thought is, okay, you can explain the regularity of the world by positing these governing laws, but now you've got a new puzzle. Why is there this very suspiciously fortunate match between the governing laws and the contents of the universe? That's not a problem for Humeanism, but it is a problem for this view that many people feel pressured towards if they abandon Humeanism for the cosmic coincidence objection.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all that's kind of plausible. I mean, the worry is like, I think there are some arguments for theism where it's like just the strength of the evidence, like for psychophysical harmony, is like just ridiculously high, like maybe like 100 to 1 or something.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, unless you have like an absurd view in philosophy of mind that's obviously false of type A physicalism, then like the argument basically it's like the odds on atheism are almost zero.
Yeah.
Psychophysical harmony. And the thought is like, I think this places a pretty high upper bound on how convincing the argument can be, because it's just like, if you have a 10% credence in Humeanism, then and it seems hard to be have to be lower than that on a view adopted by around half of philosophers, especially if like me, I haven't looked into the laws of nature debate, but then it seems like this places just an upper bound on sort of how convincing the evidence can be, because even if you're convinced that 100% of that 10% credence in Humeanism, and you think that this basically just completely disqualifies atheism plus non-Humeanism, you still basically get it's still only the strength factor of the evidence would be at 9 to 1, and so it places a limit on it, but it can still be pretty convincing.
Yeah, that's a nice point, and I like the analogy of type A materialism is to psychophysical harmony as Humeanism is to our argument, to nomological harmony. Namely, like, sure, psychophysical harmony doesn't work if you're on board with type A physicalism, just like nomological harmony doesn't work if you're on board with nomological harmony. And both of those are accepted by a decent fraction of philosophers. I think probably Humeanism is more popular than type A physicalism. But yeah, I mean it's true that you
yeah,
the argument only gets off the ground once you've set aside this other view, which I mean in both cases I don't find plausible at all. Though I mean I guess I agree with you that type A physicalism is even worse than Humeanism.
Yeah. I mean, so one other thing that I think is interesting about let me actually just briefly address actually your second argument again, or the second argument against your argument against Humeanism. Like, I don't know, you might just think that like simplicity, if you think simplicity is a virtue, you might think that just more easily compressible in Humean mosaics are just more probable because it's easier to describe their behavior.
Yeah. This is what Ted Sider says in defense of Humeanism, that like, well, both the Humean and the non-Humean should think there's some kind of like a priori bias towards simplicity, and the way that gets cashed out will maybe differ on the Humean versus non-Humean view. The Humean will cash that out by saying like, what it is for a world to be simple is for it to be such as to be described by simple generalizations. Whereas, maybe a non-human will say it's for the governing laws to have a simple formulation or something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, I do think that the bias towards simplicity here needs to be just massively strong to outweigh the sheer number of alternatives. So like on a naive kind of principle of indifference, uniform distribution over all the different ways of filling in the pixels of the Humean mosaic. If we're just going by number or natural measure or whatever for the infinite case, the regular mosaics, the simple patterned mosaics are going to be massively outnumbered. Now, maybe you say, okay, but let's give a kind of a priori bias or boost to the regular patterns, but it's got to be a really, really, really huge boost. I mean, because like the factor by which the disordered mosaics will outnumber the ordered mosaics is just like a staggeringly large number. So I wonder if, like, sure, an a priori bias towards simplicity is all good and well, but can it bear that much weight? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It sort of seems like it can, where it's like there are cases where like even a seemingly kind of small difference in simplicity makes a huge difference. So let me give two examples. The first one is, consider two hypotheses. The first one is perfect God with all the omni properties. And the second one is perfect God with all the omni properties, except he just doesn't know a random fact. He doesn't know like 600 squared or something.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are infinite permutations. There's only one possible perfect being, and there are an infinite number of facts that he could not know. Yep. Nonetheless, the hypothesis that the conjunction of all of those infinite hypotheses is basically zero, the probability of that, and the probability of theism is like pretty high. Or like modal realism minus a random world, there are infinite permutations of that. Or like the physical laws, except just like one small patch somewhere that obeys different physical laws. That's really improbable.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, so I don't want to say that things are dialectically hopeless for the Humean here. It's not a completely bonkers view. I do think there's something worth noting here, just in terms of this dialectic. So I said that, I think of the nomological argument kind of coming in once someone has rejected Humeanism for the kind of cosmic coincidence reasons and gone to some like non-Humean, let's say, governing view. And now there's a point that Humeans will make, which is like, look, you think that to explain the regularity of nature, we need these governing laws, right? But there could be like induction non-friendly governing laws. There could be horribly gruesome governing laws that say that a governing law that says that things behave thus and so up until time t and then veer off, or except in these circumstances and then go haywire, or whatever. So governing laws by themselves don't give you the regularity of nature. So how are you in a better position? Now, here I take it the standard response is, sure, but there's a kind of a priori bias towards simplicity, and the simplest governing laws will give us regularity and induction friendly worlds and so on. And now I come in and I say, okay, but let's grant the simpler governing laws are more likely. Simplicity by itself has no tendency to predict nomological harmony. If anything, it makes it harder because it would rule out the kind of ensemble explanations of nomological harmony. Like merely having simple laws doesn't predict that those laws will be such as to like match whatever things actually exist in the universe. So anyway, that's one way in which I think like the nomological harmony argument comes in an interesting way to some of these.
Yeah, I agree. If you just think simplicity is a virtue, that doesn't solve nomological harmony. But if you're a Humean and then you think simplicity is a virtue, that seems like the best. That seems like the best way to go to avoid the argument for nomological harmony.
Yeah, one further thought about simplicity. So this this is about the kind of like complementariness of the argument from nomological harmony and the psychophysical harmony argument. So I think you had a back and forth with Richard Yetter Chappelle, right, about psychophysical harmony, and I take it his thought is like, in addition to kind of priors that are biased towards simpler theories, there's also going to be like an extra fact about the priors that they're biased towards like non-wacky hypotheses, and in the psychophysically disharmonious scenarios are objectively wacky, and that's why they're ruled out by the priors. Now, from initially, my thought is something like this. This seems kind of like ad hoc, and you're just kind of introducing this new, very substantive constraint on priors that doesn't seem like it's needed elsewhere in order to get the right results. It basically, all it's doing is ruling out psychophysical harmony. And now I feel like once we bring in nomological harmonies, okay, so again, simplicity can't do it. So maybe maybe the naturalist could introduce some like further constraint on priors that makes nomological harmony very unlikely. But now it just feels like we're just kind of like, we're whacking the new moles as they come up with just like introducing like new constraints on priors. And like I had a conversation with a colleague here the other day. He's a very good philosopher, but he was suggesting like, well, maybe there's just a kind of like basic constraint on priors that makes it likely that laws will match states. And okay, that's a cost, but given the cost of theism or whatever, it might be worth it. But I start to feel like when we kind of line these arguments up and the ultimate response is, oh, I just discovered a new constraint on priors that blocks the argument, then like it just starts to look much less attractive to try to make naturalism work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think maybe the way the naturalists should go if they want to like avoid these problems is, I think they should say that there's something like just a brute constraint where like harmony or like things fitting together in some way is just more intrinsically probable. Now, I don't find that super plausible, but it doesn't seem obviously false. And you might think that can sort of explain both psychophysical harmony, nomological harmony, and a third secret type of harmony called harmonious strength that I might write a blog post about at some point that I've told Brian about.
Yeah, you definitely should. I like this idea. Yeah,
very secret, very great, under lock and key by the CIA. It's like,
yeah, good. So I would like to see other kind of independent cases where it seems like in order to get the intuitively right probabilistic results, there needs to be this additional constraint on priors that's things fitting together nicely. So I'm open to be convinced. I mean, here one case I mentioned, I think in message with you is, suppose you think at the beginning of the universe there's like a lock and a key, and both kind of come into being ex nihilo, neither has an explanation or cause or anything. What are the chances that the key fits the lock to unlock it? And I kind of feel like there shouldn't be a bias towards the view that they fit, even though that they match. But even though that would make kind of things fit together at the foundational level better than if they didn't. Now, maybe that's not the right kind of fitting together, but yeah, I guess I would want to see like what kinds of things meshing together is relevant to.
I mean, you might think that like being like meshing together well, I mean, a few things. One of them is when I think about the key case, I sort of have the intuition that you're right, but like it doesn't seem so obvious. Where like, and in particular, you might think that there's a harmony towards things being sort of like like things fitting together, like roughly in the same vein is sort of more probable, but there doesn't have to be, an exact correspondence. So like, here's something that might be more intrinsically probable: the key and the lock. Like, suppose you found out that the key was like that the key and the lock were roughly similar sizes, were in a few orders of magnitude in terms of size. It doesn't seem like that calls out for explanation, where it's like, of all the possible sizes they could be, it's very unlikely that they would pair up. Like, I don't know, that doesn't really seem like the kind of thing that needs an explanation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So not sure I agree. So here's one thought that I think Swinburne has written a bit about this. So suppose you're a naturalist and you think that like the most explanatorily basic entities, maybe they were present at the initial conditions, nothing further caused them, are just like a bunch of particles. Maybe there's like a relatively small number of different particles, and particles of the same type have exactly the same mass down to, whatever decimal place you like, and exactly the same charge and so on. But this particle and this particle, they don't have a common cause. Neither caused the other. I kind of feel like that should not be taken as brute, because that's just like an unexplained coincidence. Though I'm not sure if many would accept my intuition there. I mean, I think that's a pretty familiar picture of the world. Like, yeah, we've got these like basic things, maybe particles or something, and maybe they existed from the beginning. And yeah, we know that that they fall into groups that are mutually very similar to one another. That's just bedrock. That seems to me not a good candidate for a bedrock truth, because it involves precisely because it involves things lining up in a way that's very improbable, absent further explanation.
Yeah.
And in
Well,
fact, I guess I think like one of the main facts about a phenomenon that makes it call for explanation is things kind of lining up in a really striking way. Keys fitting locks, or like, you and I wearing the same shirt color for 300 days in a row, et cetera. Like things lining up is precisely what makes us think that has a further explanation that shouldn't just be taken as brute.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like clearly non-fundamental things lining up requires explanation, because, like non-fundamental things, there's not a constraint on simplicity, because, they're composed of the fundamental stuff. But in terms of fundamental stuff, like, I don't know. I mean, maybe there isn't a constraint, but it doesn't seem so obvious. Like, I don't know, when I think about the fact that particles are not a billion times larger than other particles, like, it is kind of hard to be like really, really confident that that this doesn't have an explanation. And if you think that harmony isn't just intrinsically probable, that things fitting together makes the theory better, then you basically get to explain all three kinds of harmony, including the mysterious, secret, extra kind, all in one fell swoop. So I think like maybe if you're like a theist, you shouldn't accept that, because you think that these are not things that call out for explanations, because you have an explanation, God. But if you are not a theist, then maybe you should think that these things call out for explanation. I don't know. It seems weirdest in the psychophysical harmony case, where it's like, if you do have these things that are just like that are these totally like mental and physical things are not the same.
Yeah,
they can only be the same like representationally. So a mental thing can represent a physical thing, but like if A represents B, it definitely doesn't seem like A and B going together is like extra probable, right? So suppose there are two, there was a random series at the fundamental core of reality. There's a random series of letters, and then there's also a giant pyramid or something. It's not more probable that like the best code for the fundamental letters also would describe the pyramid in detail. Like if that were the case, that would clearly call out for explanation. Yeah. And so I think that's the case for psychophysical harmony. Maybe you can say a similar thing about nomological harmony.
Yeah. So,
well, I don't think so, because it's not just like representationally. It's just like they actually just do apply to things that happen to exist. So yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah. So I like that example of the pyramid case. I mean, one thought about psychophysical harmony is, okay, psychophysical harmony is one way for things for the mental and the physical to fit together. There are a lot of other ways, just like simple mappings from the physical to the phenomenal, where they would fit together in some intuitively good sense, even though they wouldn't like respect the norms of rationality. like the bad states wouldn't go with avoidance behavior and so on. And it seems like the fact that because like we imagine just like a simple mapping where every particle has some like grayscale experience with a lightness proportional to its mass or something. That's a way for the mental and the physical to really fit together. This experiential intensity just perfectly matches the match. It's neat, it's clean, it goes together, but it doesn't go together in a way where like norms about what we ought to do are matched by the actual functional roles. And so maybe the way in which the mental and physical go together in a kind of like rational norm respecting way and in a truth generating way calls for explanation more than if they just kind of fit together in some tidy way or other.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Yeah, one other thing that one type of nomological harmony that I think is especially puzzling, at least if you're a dualist, is nomological harmony applied to consciousness.
Yeah.
Where like for consciousness, it does seem like the most coincidental and miraculous because, unless you're like a panpsychist, and probably even if you are a panpsychist, you'll think that consciousness, at least of the type that we have, is like a very late addition to the universe that only emerges from a very particular type of thing. So it's like, even if you have a powers, like, even if you have a powers view or something, or even if you're a Humean, it is kind of weird that just one of the ways reality happens to be is that when you get atoms together in a certain arrangement, just consciousness appears. Where like even if you have psychophysical laws, it's weird that the psychophysical laws match the stuff that exists.
Yeah, good. So suppose, the psychophysical laws only kick in once you have like brain-like configurations, let's suppose, and that's really late in the universe, and it only happens in a small number of places in the universe, and seems like it could very well have like not happened at all. I mean, so that is a kind of nomological harmony. I take it the main worry along these lines is like that's just not a way that a fundamental law should look. It should like fundamental laws should like apply pretty ubiquitously. They should they shouldn't just kick in, 8 billion years after things got going. They shouldn't apply just like on a few isolated planets. I mean, I think a priori on naturalism, especially, that is a very weird way for a fundamental law to look, even apart from the psychophysical harmony. I think things look less bad for the theists here because, like, if you think like the whole point or one big part of the point of God creating the universe was to like make a home for minds, then like, having these kind of like laws that only kick in once you got a hospitable environment for minds, like that's not so weird if it's ordered to that purpose.
Yeah, I agree. Though I do think that that's a slightly separate point where it's like it's extremely weird that there are that like the consciousness, which is arguably, and I think is a prerequisite for literally anything in the universe to have value, where it's like it feels like the consciousness laws were designed kind of specially for us.
Yeah.
Where it's like it just doesn't apply to almost anything in the universe.
Yeah.
Where like people would often, point to us being back when there was the belief that humans were in the center of the universe. They would think that sort of favored theism, and it was like the universe is made for us. But that kind of is true with the psychophysical laws, where it's like there's a special law just for things like us that was inapplicable for the first 11 billion years of the universe or something. Or 200 if you're if you're a younger patient. But you should.
Yeah, we're at the nomological center of the universe, you could say, and in fact, like, well, I mean, if you think about like cosmological fine tuning, maybe it even looks worse because like all of these basic physical parameters, like you can think of them as like conspiring to make kind of roughly animal-like bodies. And like, why animal-like bodies? Because those are going to be like a hospitable home for minds, and so for beings like us. And so this idea of like humans, or at least rational or sentient beings, being at the nomological center of the universe, I think is a a nice point.
Yeah, and I think that wow, so a fourth kind of harmony, like nomological centering harmony or something. Uh, we'll have to think of a better name for it. But yeah, but I do think that that's a slightly like I think that's a good point, but I do think that that's a little bit separate from nomological harmony as just applied to consciousness, where it's like even once you have laws that say that certain higher order that certain like complex arrangements of stuff rather than fundamental stuff is what gets you consciousness. You also have to have that stuff. So there could have been laws, or even in a Humean sense, that say integrated information gets consciousness, and then there never been integrated information. And so it's weird that you both have the stuff that gives you consciousness and the like, and the and the laws that like you have laws that say when you have x's, where x is some complicated higher order arrangement of stuff, then you get consciousness, and then you also happen to have x's. Yeah. I think that's kind of a weird thing. So one objection to the argument is you might have a governing account of laws, but you might think that just what a governing law is a governing law is sort of like a function that specifies from an arrangement of initial stuff the evolution of that stuff. So and then if that's true, then it just like it doesn't even make sense to talk about governing laws that are inapplicable. It's like a governing law just is, or it just is what maps. It's just a function that maps initial states to later states over the temporal evolve.
But it's going to be a function that maps not just actual states, but counterfactual states to initial. I mean, that's true for, so like take the laws of classical mechanics. There's some particular trajectory that, there's some particular world history that we have that follows out the laws, but there's a range of other possible trajectories that we would have gone in had things started out in a different state, right? So we can, let's think of governing laws as just functions from possible states to future states consequent upon those. Then I don't see why that makes it inconceivable that there could be governing laws that fail to match. So just take the function that maps every Schmass involving state to some relevant successor state. That there are no actual states that are in the domain of that function, but that function still could be in effect, right?
Yeah, well, the thought would be that it doesn't merely map possible states to possible initial states to later states, but that what laws are is they're just maps between what the initial conditions in fact are to later states.
Oh, but then, I mean, we should be able to answer questions like, holding fixed the laws, if the initial conditions had been this other way, how would things have gone? And we can do that.
Well, I think what you would think is that holding fixed the laws while having different initial conditions is just like not a thing that you could do, because laws just are maps from what the initial conditions in fact are to later states.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess my point is, but that's not how we actually think of physical laws. Like, I mean, just like in classical mechanics, we can hold fixed the laws and then just consider various counterfactual starting points and then apply those laws to those starting points. But I mean, I guess more, I guess I would say like the natural way of thinking about a governing law is some kind of entity or fact that is kind of poised to generate new states when, like, in the condition that a certain original state holds. So it's poised to generate a certain later condition given a certain initial condition. Now, something could have that kind of like poised power with respect to conditions that are never actually satisfied. Or, the typical way that, like, if you're like someone like Maudlin or John Carroll, and you kind of like lay out this kind of like primitivist view of governing laws, the basic gnomic facts will be captured by some kind of like sentential operator. It is the law that P. And, so like those are going to be the bedrock gnomic facts. And you could just have instances of P that just don't actually apply to anything. So it's a law that all schmassive things behave thus and so, but there are no schmassive things.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. I think that might be right. Yeah. I'd have to think more about that. But yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't have any more questions, and you said you had to go, or sort of around the hour mark. So, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, not a whole lot. I would encourage you to write up your strength harmony argument in a blog post. I thought that was a cool idea, and yeah, big fan of the blog, and I like seeing the content that you produce, and it's good to be on the show.
All right, yeah, thank you, and I enjoy a lot of your papers. Yeah, I think you're good. All right, take care.
See you.